Part 1. Operation Barbarossa and Germany's lightning advance. In the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler believed he was only a few months away from winning the greatest war in history. Western Europe had already fallen before the unstoppable German war machine. Poland had been crushed in weeks. France, one of Europe's strongest military powers, collapsed in just 46 days. Everywhere German soldiers marched, victory seemed inevitable. There was only one obstacle left: the Soviet Union. To Hitler, destroying the Soviet Union was more than just another military campaign. It was the key to building an empire that would last for generations. He believed that once Moscow fell, the Soviet government would collapse, the Red Army would surrender, and Germany would become the undisputed ruler of Europe. What followed would become the largest military invasion the world had ever seen. At dawn on June 22nd, 1941, nearly 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border. More than 3,000 tanks rolled eastward, while thousands of aircraft filled the skies. Alongside them marched hundreds of thousands of troops from Germany's allies, creating an invasion force unlike anything in human history. The operation was called Operation Barbarossa. Hitler expected the campaign to last no longer than 4 months. German generals were equally confident. Their strategy relied on lightning-fast attacks, known as blitzkrieg. Tanks would smash through enemy defenses, while aircraft destroyed communication lines and supply depots. Infantry would surround massive Soviet armies before they could retreat. The strategy had worked perfectly across Europe. There was no reason, they believed, that it would fail now. But the Soviet Union was unlike any enemy Germany had faced before. Stretching thousands of kilometers from west to east, it possessed enormous reserves of manpower, factories, and natural resources. Yet Hitler dismissed these advantages. He believed the Soviet military had been weakened by Stalin's political purges, where thousands of experienced officers had been imprisoned or executed. German intelligence also underestimated Soviet production capabilities. According to German estimates, the Soviet Union possessed around 10,000 tanks. In reality, it had far more. Many of them were outdated, but hidden among them was a revolutionary design that would later shock German commanders: the T-34 tank. At first, however, none of this seemed to matter. The invasion unfolded almost exactly as Hitler had imagined. Entire Soviet divisions were surrounded within days. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were captured in enormous encirclements near Białystok, Minsk, and Smolensk. German armored columns advanced so rapidly that many Soviet commanders lost contact with their own headquarters. Roads became clogged with retreating civilians, abandoned vehicles, and desperate soldiers trying to escape the advancing Wehrmacht. From the air, the Luftwaffe dominated almost completely. During the opening days of the invasion, thousands of Soviet aircraft were destroyed, many before they had even managed to take off. For German soldiers, it appeared that victory was only a matter of time. Every morning brought new advances. Every evening brought news of another Soviet defeat. German newspapers celebrated what they described as the collapse of Bolshevism. Officers confidently predicted they would be celebrating Christmas back in Berlin. Even many foreign observers believed Germany was unstoppable. But beneath these spectacular victories, invisible cracks had already begun to appear. German supply columns struggled to keep pace with the rapidly advancing front lines. Fuel trucks traveled hundreds of kilometers over poor roads. Repair crews could barely keep damaged tanks operational. The farther the Wehrmacht advanced, the more difficult it became to deliver ammunition, food, and fuel. Every kilometer east made Germany stronger on the battlefield, but weaker behind the lines. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening inside the Soviet Union. Instead of surrendering, Soviet factories were being dismantled piece by piece. Entire industrial plants, including machines, workers, and their families, were loaded onto trains and transported thousands of kilometers east, beyond the Ural Mountains. It was one of the greatest industrial evacuations in history. German bombers could destroy empty factory buildings, but they could not destroy factories that had disappeared. At the same time, Stalin refused to consider peace. His message to the Soviet people was simple: fight, retreat if necessary, but never surrender. As the summer of 1941 came to an end, German forces had achieved victories beyond anything seen in modern warfare. Millions of Soviet soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Thousands of tanks had been destroyed. Entire cities had fallen. Yet Moscow, the ultimate prize, still stood far beyond the horizon, and every passing day brought Hitler's army closer to an enemy far more dangerous than the Red Army itself: distance, time, and the Russian winter. Part 2: Hitler's Fatal Mistakes and the Road to Moscow. By late August 1941, Germany appeared closer than ever to total victory. Army Group Center had smashed through Soviet defenses and was driving relentlessly toward Moscow. Many German commanders believed the war could be ended with one final push. The Soviet capital was not only the political heart of the nation, but also its largest transportation hub. Nearly every major railway connecting the Western Soviet Union passed through Moscow. If the city fell, German generals believed Soviet communications would collapse, supply lines would break apart, and the Red Army would lose its ability to coordinate the defense of the country. It seemed like the perfect moment to strike, but Adolf Hitler made a decision that would change the course of the war. Instead of allowing Army Group Center to continue directly toward Moscow, he ordered large numbers of tanks and experienced divisions to turn south toward Ukraine and north toward Leningrad. Hitler believed destroying Soviet armies and capturing valuable resources was more important than taking the capital itself. Many of his most respected generals strongly disagreed. Heinz Guderian argued that speed was Germany's greatest weapon, and that every day of delay gave the Soviets time to recover. Other commanders shared the same concern, but Hitler refused to change his mind. The decision delayed the assault on Moscow by several critical weeks. At first, the gamble appeared successful. German forces surrounded enormous Soviet armies near Kiev, in one of the largest encirclements in military history. More than 500,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. Newspapers across Europe celebrated another spectacular German triumph, and Hitler became even more convinced that his strategy had been correct. What those headlines failed to mention was the cost of victory. German tanks had traveled thousands of kilometers without proper maintenance. Engines were wearing out, tracks were breaking, spare parts were becoming increasingly difficult to deliver. Trucks that were supposed to carry ammunition and fuel often arrived empty because they had burned most of their fuel simply reaching the front. Every kilometer deeper into the Soviet Union stretched Germany's supply network closer to its breaking point. Then came another enemy no military planner could defeat: the weather. As September turned into October, heavy rains transformed the roads into endless fields of thick mud. The Russians called the season Rasputitsa, the time when the earth itself became a weapon. Roads disappeared beneath deep mud. Trucks became trapped for hours, sometimes days. Horses struggled to pull artillery pieces. Even the mighty German tanks slowed to a crawl, their tracks spinning helplessly, while crews desperately searched for solid ground. Entire supply convoys stood motionless. Fuel failed to reach the front. Food arrived late or not at all. Ammunition deliveries became unpredictable. Soldiers who only weeks earlier had advanced dozens of kilometers each day now measured progress in mere hundreds of meters. The blitzkrieg that had shocked Europe depended on speed. Without speed, it began to lose its greatest advantage. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was changing. Factories that had been dismantled during the summer were already operating far beyond the Ural Mountains. Day and night, they produced tanks, rifles, artillery, and ammunition faster than German intelligence believed possible. Fresh divisions arrived from every corner of the country. Even more importantly, Soviet intelligence had learned that Japan was preparing to move south into the Pacific rather than attack Siberia. That meant Stalin could safely transfer some of his best trained Siberian divisions west toward Moscow. These were not exhausted soldiers fleeing from defeat. They were well-equipped troops trained to fight in freezing conditions, while German soldiers still expected to finish the campaign before winter. The Soviets were preparing for a war that could last for years. In early October, Hitler finally launched the long-awaited offensive against Moscow. The operation was given the name Operation Typhoon. Hundreds of thousands of German troops advanced once again, hoping to crush Soviet resistance before snow began to fall. During the opening phase, German forces achieved another series of dramatic victories. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded near Vyazma and Bryansk. Hundreds of thousands more prisoners were captured. Once again, it seemed that the road to Moscow had finally opened, but appearances were deceiving. Every battle cost Germany experienced officers, veteran tank crews, and irreplaceable equipment. Replacements arriving from Germany lacked the combat experience of the men they replaced. Tanks that broke down were often abandoned because recovery vehicles could not reach them through the mud. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Soldiers marched for days with little food, wearing uniforms designed for autumn rather than the brutal Russian winter. Then, for the first time since the invasion had begun, German soldiers noticed something unsettling. The Red Army was no longer collapsing. Again and again, new defensive lines appeared. Villages were defended street by street. Bridges were destroyed before German engineers could cross them. Soviet troops fought harder than they had only a few months earlier. Every kilometer toward Moscow demanded more blood than the last. The closer Germany came to the Soviet capital, the slower its advance became. And beyond the horizon, hidden beneath dark clouds and falling temperatures, another enemy was waiting, an enemy that neither Hitler nor his generals had truly prepared to face. Winter was coming. Part 3. Winter, the Soviet counteroffensive, and the fall of Hitler's dream. When the first snow began to fall in early November 1941, many German soldiers welcomed it. The endless mud that had trapped trucks and tanks finally froze, making roads passable again. Commanders believed this was the opportunity they had been waiting for. If they pushed hard enough, Moscow could still be captured before the Soviet Union had time to recover. Hitler ordered the offensive to continue at all costs. Retreat was forbidden. Every kilometer toward the Soviet capital was to be fought for, regardless of the price. German spearheads advanced closer than ever before. In some sectors, reconnaissance units could already see the distant skyline of Moscow through their binoculars. The city seemed almost within reach. For exhausted soldiers who had marched and fought for more than 5 months, victory felt just one final effort away. But the German army was no longer the unstoppable force that had crossed the Soviet border in June. Thousands of vehicles had broken down from constant use. Tank engines failed in the freezing temperatures. Lubricants thickened, making machines difficult to start. Fuel froze inside supply containers. Weapons jammed after only a few shots. Trucks refused to move on icy roads, and horses, the backbone of Germany's logistics, collapsed from exhaustion, hunger, and the bitter cold. Even worse, the German high command had made a fatal assumption. They believed the war would end before winter arrived. As a result, millions of winter uniforms had never been delivered to the front. Many soldiers wore thin autumn coats, ordinary leather boots, and light gloves, completely unsuitable for temperatures that dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. During the night, men wrapped themselves in blankets, newspapers, or pieces of cloth simply to survive until morning. Some awoke to discover their rifles frozen solid. Others never woke up at all. Frostbite spread through entire divisions. Thousands of soldiers lost fingers, toes, or feet without ever seeing the enemy. Yet despite unimaginable suffering, Hitler refused to authorize a large-scale withdrawal. His orders remained absolute: hold every position, advance whenever possible, never retreat. While the German army struggled against the cold, the Soviet Union was preparing its counterattack. Fresh Siberian divisions arrived around Moscow almost every day. Unlike the exhausted German troops, these soldiers were equipped with thick white winter uniforms, warm boots, skis, and experience fighting in extreme weather. Their tanks started reliably in freezing temperatures. Their commanders understood how to use the harsh winter as an ally rather than fear it. Meanwhile, civilians inside Moscow worked day and night building defensive lines. Women, teenagers, and elderly citizens dug anti-tank trenches, constructed barriers, and fortified roads leading into the capital. Factories that had remained in the city continued producing weapons despite constant air raids. Stalin himself chose to stay in Moscow, refusing to abandon the capital even when many expected its fall. His decision strengthened morale across the country. Then, on December 5th, 1941, everything changed. Without warning, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive across the entire Moscow front. Thousands of artillery guns opened fire simultaneously. Soviet infantry attacked through forests and frozen fields, while ski battalions moved rapidly across terrain the Germans could barely cross. Fresh T-34 tanks smashed into exhausted German positions. For the first time since Operation Barbarossa had begun, it was the Wehrmacht, not the Red Army, that was forced into desperate defensive battles. German commanders urgently requested permission to fall back to shorter, more defensible lines. Hitler refused. He believed that any retreat would become a complete collapse, similar to Napoleon's disastrous withdrawal more than a century earlier. Instead, divisions were ordered to stand their ground regardless of casualties. The result was devastating. Entire units became trapped in exposed positions without adequate food, ammunition, or winter clothing. Some fought until they had almost no bullets left. Others abandoned damaged equipment simply because there was no fuel to move it. Every day, the Red Army pushed the Germans farther away from Moscow. By January 1942, Hitler's dream of capturing the Soviet capital had completely collapsed. Operation Barbarossa had failed. The quick victory Germany expected in just a few months had turned into a brutal war of attrition against an enemy with enormous reserves of manpower, industry, and determination. The consequences reached far beyond the battlefield. Germany had suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties. Thousands of tanks, trucks, and aircraft had been destroyed or abandoned. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht had been shattered for the first time. Around the world, governments realized that Nazi Germany could be stopped. For the Soviet Union, the defense of Moscow became a symbol of survival. It proved that the Red Army could not only resist Germany's greatest offensive, but also force it backward. The victory inspired millions of Soviet citizens and marked the beginning of a long road that would eventually lead all the way to Berlin. Many historians still debate which single decision cost Hitler the chance to take Moscow. Was it diverting his armies toward Kiev? Underestimating Soviet industrial power, ignoring logistics, failing to prepare for winter, or believing that ideology mattered more than military reality? The truth is that no single mistake destroyed Operation Barbarossa. It was the combination of overconfidence, impossible distances, exhausted supply lines, fierce Soviet resistance, catastrophic weather, and strategic miscalculations that turned Germany's greatest invasion into one of history's greatest military failures. The battle for Moscow did more than save a city. It destroyed the illusion of an easy German victory. From that moment forward, the Third Reich was no longer fighting a short campaign. It had entered a war it could never truly win. The road to Moscow became the road to Germany's defeat.